The guards had a rule: no one goes near the black cage after dark. She went every single night. The stone flags of the lower kennels were slick with a cold sweat that never dried, even in summer, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something wild and deeply sad. Alara carried no lantern. Light made the shadows deeper, and she had learned long ago that it was better to move within the darkness than to fight it. Her bare feet made no sound. In her hands, she cupped a wooden bowl, still warm. Inside was a portion of her own meager supper, roasted root vegetables, and a strip of salted meat softened in broth and torn into small, manageable pieces. She'd laced it with the bruised leaves of a calming herb, the scent a faint, clean counterpoint to the kennel's miasma. The cage was a monolith of wrought iron at the far end of the passage, set apart from the yapping hounds and prized hunting beasts. It was larger than the other enclosures, its bars thick as a man's wrist, its lock a complex thing of gears and tumblers that no one but the king himself was said to operate. Inside, a shape shifted, a ripple in the absolute black. Two eyes, the color of dying embers, opened and fixed on her. There was no growl. There was never a growl for her, only a sound, low and resonant, that was less a noise and more a vibration she felt in the bones of her feet. The deep, quiet chuff of a large predator, recognizing a familiar presence, Elara knelt, her knees pressing into the damp stone. She slid the bowl through a narrow gap near the floor, a space just wide enough for this small treason. "I brought you something," she whispered. Her voice was a thread of sound easily lost. The creature, the Graylin, the king's prized and feared monster, moved closer. A massive head shaped like a wolf's, but scaled in places with shimmering obsidian plates, lowered to the bowl. A forked tongue, dark as shadow, flickered out to taste the offering. She watched it eat. Its movements were not frenzied, but deliberate, almost delicate. It had been starved when the king's hunters dragged it from the blighted peaks, a thing of rage and broken teeth. Now, its coat was a deep, healthy black, the fur thick over powerful shoulders. She had done that. These stolen scraps, this nightly pilgrimage, had mended something in the beast that brute force and chains could not. When the bowl was clean, the Graylin nudged it back toward her with its snout. It rested its head against the bars, the ember eyes half closing. Ilara reached forward, her fingers trembling only slightly, as they always did at first. She laid her palm flat against the cold iron, her fingers slipping between the bars to touch the coarse fur and smooth scales of its jaw. It leaned into her touch, a sigh shuddering through its great body. This was the secret she kept coiled in her heart. She was not afraid of it. She was afraid for it. She understood the particular agony of being caged for a crime you did not choose to commit. It was in this shared silence, this exchange of warmth for trust, that she found a strange and fragile peace. She did not know that she, in turn, was being watched. From the deep shadows of the upper archway, a figure stood motionless, a column of darkness against the stone. King Kalen had been there for an hour. He had been there every night for a week, ever since a nervous guard had spoken of a ghost flitting through the kennels. He had expected a spy, a saboteur, someone trying to poison his most valuable weapon. He found a slip of a kitchen maid, a girl whose name he did not know, committing an act of impossible gentleness. He watched her hand, steady and sure, stroking the deadliest creature in his kingdom. He saw the Graylin which had torn a man's arm off for looking at it too long, melt under her touch like a dog seeking comfort. He felt a dislocation in his own chest, a shifting of foundations he had believed to be granite. This girl, with her quiet defiance of his explicit orders, was not afraid, and in her lack of fear, she held a power he had never witnessed before. It was not the power of a crown or a sword or an army. It was something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. She was a key, turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. The silence that followed her retreat was a different kind of silence. It was heavier, laced with the king's presence. Alara felt it before she saw him, a sudden drop in the temperature of the air, a stillness that was not empty but occupied. When he stepped from the archway, the torchlight from the upper hall caught the silver threads in his black hair and the hard line of his jaw. He moved with the same lethal grace as the creature in the cage, each step a deliberate, measured act. Alara froze, her hands still outstretched toward the bars, the wooden bowl clutched in her other. The kennel was a dead end, and he was the only way out. She straightened her spine, pulling her hand back slowly, and faced him. She had seen the king from a distance, a remote figure of iron and shadow, but up close, he was overwhelming. He was taller than she'd imagined, and his eyes were not the cold gray of stone, but the turbulent gray of a storm-tossed sea. They missed nothing. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze flicking from her face to the empty bowl, then to the Graylin, which had risen to its feet, a low rumble starting in its chest. The beast was watching him, its ember eyes narrowed. It was not a sound of aggression, but of warning. It was protecting her. Kalen's expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "You have a name," he said. It was not a question. His voice was like his presence, low, quiet, and carrying an immense weight. Ilara. She did not look away. To look away was to admit guilt, to show fear. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but her gaze was steady. She had been underestimated her entire life. It was a cloak she wore with practiced ease. "And you, Alara," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "are either the bravest fool in my kingdom or the most cunning." He took another step, and the Greylin's rumble deepened, the sound of claws scraping stone as the beast shifts its weight. Kalen ignored it, his attention fixed solely on her. Every guard knows the penalty for coming here. Every servant whispers stories about this beast. Yet you bring it your dinner. She lifted her chin. It was hungry. The simplicity of her answer seemed to stop him. He stared at her, and she felt his gaze not as an accusation, but as an assessment. He was taking her apart, piece by piece, searching for the trick, the angle, the motive. He was a man who understood power, and what she was doing was a form of it. He could not categorize. "It is a weapon," he said, his voice flat, "a tool of war. It is not a stray dog to be pitied. Even weapons must be maintained," she countered, her voice quiet but firm, "or they break." His eyes narrowed. For a long, breathless moment, the only sounds were the distant barking of the hounds and the threatening hum from the black cage. She expected shouting, guards, the cold finality of the dungeons. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Tomorrow night," he said, the words precise and absolute, "you will do this again. But you will not do it alone." He turned without another word and walked away, his dark cloak swirling around his heels. His footsteps echoed on the stone, each one a hammer blow against the silence he left behind. Alara stood trembling, now that the danger had passed, her knuckles white where she gripped the small wooden bowl. He hadn't punished her. He hadn't forbidden it. He had commanded it. He had taken her secret act of rebellion, of compassion, and turned it into a royal decree. She was no longer a ghost in the kennels. She was an appointment, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her quiet, hidden life was over. The cage was no longer just the beast's. It was now hers, too. The following night, the air in the kennels was taut as a drawn bowstring. Alara walked the familiar path, but nothing felt the same. Her steps, usually silent, seemed to echo in the charged atmosphere. He was already there, standing by the cage as if he had been carved from the same shadows he occupied. He wore no crown, no finery, only simple black leathers that made him seem less like a king and more like a hunter or a predator. He did not turn as she approached his attention on the Graylin. The beast was pacing, a restless, fluid movement of muscle and scale. It knew he was there, and it did not like it. When Alara came into view, it stopped, its head lifting, the ember eyes finding her in the gloom. The low chuffing sound it made was softer this time, a question. She knelt in her usual spot, her body a shield between the king and the cage. She slid the bowl through the bars. Tonight, she had brought more. A larger piece of meat, a handful of sweet berries saved from the kitchens. The Graylin ate, but its eyes kept flicking toward the silent man who watched them both. Kalen said nothing. He simply stood, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence a physical weight in the air. Ilara focused on the beast, on the familiar ritual of stroking its jaw once the bowl was empty. She tried to lose herself in the quiet connection, but she could feel the king's gaze on her hands, on her face. It was unnerving, an inspection that went deeper than skin, minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was not peaceful. As it had been when she was alone, it was a living thing, a battlefield where unspoken questions and challenges were exchanged. She was hyper-aware of every detail about him. The way the faint torchlight caught the worn hilt of the dagger at his belt, the controlled stillness of his posture, the almost imperceptible scent of cold iron and night air that clung to him. He was a man encased in silence, a fortress of solitude. When the growlin finally settled, resting its head against the bars, Alara prepared to leave. She rose slowly, her joints stiff. "Did you see what you wanted to see, Your Majesty?" The words were out before she could stop them, sharper than she intended. He finally turned his head, his storm gray eyes meeting hers. A flicker of something surprised respect passed through them. "I am not yet certain what I am looking for," he admitted, his voice a low murmur. He moved then, stepping closer, not to her, but to the cage. The Graylin tensed, a growl vibrating in its throat, but it did not retreat from her side. Kalen stopped, just out of its reach, his gaze analytical. "It trusts you," he stated. "It was starving," she corrected quietly. Trust and desperation often look the same at first. His gaze shifted back to her, sharp and penetrating. "And which is it now?" She held his stare, refusing to be intimidated. "That is for the beast to decide, not me." She saw it again, that subtle shift in his expression, the slight relaxing of the hard line of his mouth. It wasn't a smile, not even close, but it was a crack in the granite facade. He was used to sycophants and enemies, to people who wanted his power or feared his wrath. He was not used to a servant girl who spoke to him as if he were merely a man, and a man who was in her way. This became their new ritual. Every night she would come, and he would be there waiting. They rarely spoke. He watched. She fed the Graylin. The silence between them grew, but its character changed. It was no longer a battlefield, but a shared space, a territory they were both cautiously exploring. She learned the nuances of his stillness, the subtle shifts in his posture that betrayed his thoughts. He, in turn, seemed to be memorizing her every gesture, the way she tore the meat, the soft words she murmured to the beast, the fearless way she offered her touch. It was an intimacy forged in darkness and silence, more potent than any whispered confession. One night, as she was leaving, a shadow detached itself from the main castle entrance. "Working late, little mouse?" The voice was smooth as oiled leather, but with an edge of steel beneath it. She recognized him instantly. Lord Valerius, the king's cousin and most trusted advisor, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He stood directly in her path, blocking her way to the servants' quarters. The kennels are a strange place for a kitchen maid after dark. Ilara's heart seized. Valerius was the king's shadow, but it was a shadow with its own ambitions. The hounds needed fresh water, my lord. It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. His smile widened, showing teeth that were just a little too sharp. Of course. Such dedication. The king must value your service highly. He let his gaze drift pointedly toward the lower kennels, then back to her face. He has been spending a great deal of time down there himself lately, inspecting his assets. The word was weighted with insinuation. Be careful, little mouse. The king's pets have a tendency to be put down when they are no longer useful. He stepped aside, a gesture of mock courtesy. Ilara hurried past, his cold laughter following her into the darkness. She felt a new kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with beasts or kings in shadow. It was the fear of being a pawn in a game she was only just beginning to comprehend, a game where the board was a kingdom and the price of losing was more than just her life. The storm broke on the fifth night of their shared vigil. Not outside, but within the cage. Elara arrived to find the Greyland in a state she had never seen before. It was not pacing. It was throwing its immense weight against the iron bars, a sound like thunder rolling through the stone corridor. The percussive, metallic boom of a heavy body hitting iron, followed by a raw, agonized roar. Its eyes were wild, the embers burning with a frantic, terrified light. Kalen was there, standing further back than usual, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His face was a mask of grim control, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the coiled readiness for violence. "It has been like this for an hour," he said, his voice tight. "Something has set it off." Elara ignored him, her focus entirely on the distressed animal. She knelt, her bowl of food forgotten beside her. "Shh." "Now," she whispered, her voice carrying a calm she did not feel. "It's me. You're safe." The Greyland paid her no mind. It slammed against the bars again, a guttural shriek tearing from its throat. It was a sound of pure memory, of a pain she could only guess at. The smell of ozone and fear filled the air. She saw raw patches on its shoulders, where it had scraped itself against the iron. "What happened to it?" she asked, her gaze still locked on the beast. "Before it was brought here," Kalen was silent for a moment, "my hunters used iron nets and fire to trap it. It fought for 2 days before it fell. Fire. The memory of fire. That's what this was. A nightmare raging behind its eyes. She had to get closer. She moved toward the cage, her hand outstretched. "Stay back," Kalen commanded, his voice sharp as broken glass. "It will not know." But she did not listen. She knew what it was to be haunted by a past that others saw only as a scar. She pressed her cheek against the cold bars, her voice a low, steady murmur. She did not use words of comfort, but sang a fragment of an old lullaby, a simple, toneless melody her mother used to hum when the winter nights were too long and the food was scarce. It was a song about finding warmth in the darkness. The Greyland stilled. Its rampage ceased, its massive body trembling. It turned its head, the wildness in its eyes receding, replaced by a profound and aching confusion. It looked at her, its breathing harsh and ragged, and then it did something it had never done before. It lunged, not at the bars, but at the space where her face was. It happened too fast to comprehend. A blur of black, a flash of teeth. Alara flinched back, but in that same instant, an arm, like a band of iron, wrapped around her waist, yanking her backward. She stumbled into a hard chest, the world spinning. Kalen stood over her, his body a shield, his sword now half drawn, its polished steel gleaming in the torchlight. He had moved with impossible speed. The Greyland slammed against the bars where her head had been a second before, its jaws snapping shut with a sound like a guillotine. But there was no rage in the action now, only a desperate, frustrated grief. Ilara's breath hitched. She was pressed against the king, his arm still locked around her. She could feel the solid beat of his heart against her back, the rigid tension in his muscles. He smelled of leather and cold steel, and beneath that, something elementally male, like earth and winter. He did not release her. He held her there for a long moment, his breathing as controlled as ever, his gaze fixed on the now whimpering beast. "I told you to stay back," he said, his voice a low vibration against her ear. It held no anger. It held something else, something rougher and more complicated. She found her voice, though it was shaky. "It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to reach me." He slowly loosened his grip, allowing her to step away. Though he did not move back, the space between them had vanished, shattered by the brief, necessary violence of his protection. The air was thick with it. He looked down at her, his storm-gray eyes searching her face, as if checking for damage she could not see herself. "Why?" he asked. The word was quiet, almost lost in the Greyland's sorrowful cries. It wasn't a question about her recklessness. It was the question he had been holding back for nights. Why this beast? Why this risk? Why her? Alara looked from his guarded face to the magnificent, broken creature in the cage. She finally gave him the truth, a piece of her own brokenness she had offered to no one. "Because no one else will," she said softly. "And I know what it is to be the monster everyone is afraid to touch." His expression tightened. The mask of the king slipped, and for a fleeting second, she saw the man beneath, a man who recognized her words, not as a confession, but as a mirror. His stillness after her admission was different. It was no longer the watchful quiet of a king observing a subject, but the profound silence of a man who has heard his own unspoken thoughts voiced by another. He did not press her for details of the past that had shaped her, just as she did not ask about the crown that shaped him. The shared knowledge hung in the air between them, a fragile, unspoken treaty. He began to speak more during their nightly vigils, though his words were sparse, like stones dropped into a deep well. He asked about the herbs she used, their properties, where she learned of them. He spoke of the Greyland's origins, not as a monster from a story, but as the last of its kind, a relic of an older, wilder world that had no place in his own. He never spoke of himself, yet Ilara felt she was learning him in the spaces between his words. She learned he valued precision, that he despised waste, that he saw the world as a series of interlocking patterns he was constantly trying to decipher. She was an anomaly he could not solve, and his fascination was a palpable force. One evening, he was holding a small, intricately carved box. When the Greyland was calm, its head resting near the bars, he knelt beside Alara. The movement was so unexpected it startled her. The king did not kneel. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a salve, glistening and dark green. For its shoulders, he said, his voice low. The healers prepared it. It will prevent infection and ease the pain. He held it out to her. It was a test and a concession. He was admitting her role, her connection, was something his authority could not replicate. He was trusting her not just with his beast, but with an acknowledgement of her unique power. Her fingers brushed his as she took the small pot. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a sudden, sharp awareness of the man beside her. His skin was cool, calloused. She turned to the Greylan, her heart beating a little faster. "It's all right," she murmured, more to herself than to the beast. She scooped a small amount of the salve onto her fingers and with infinite slowness reached through the bars. The Greylan flinched at the new scent, but when it saw the offering came from her hand, it allowed it. She gently worked the cool ointment into the raw, scraped skin on its powerful shoulder. The beast sighed, a deep rumble of relief, and leaned into her touch more heavily than ever before. Kalen watched her hands, his expression unreadable. "You have a gentle touch for a girl with so much iron in her spine," he observed quietly. Elara did not look at him, keeping her attention on her task. "Perhaps it is the iron that makes the gentleness possible," she replied. "It is hard to be gentle when you are afraid of breaking." When she finished, she wiped her hands on a cloth she'd brought, her movements precise. She felt him watching her, the weight of his gaze, of physical presence. She thought he would leave, as he often did after the ritual was complete, but he remained kneeling on the cold stone. "My father," he began, and the word hung in the air, heavy with history. "He collected creatures like this. He saw them as symbols of his power. He would starve them, break them, parade them in chains to show that he could master the wild. He believed that was what it meant to be strong." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a memory she could not access. He died on his throne alone, surrounded by trophies that feared him and men who wanted what he had. He looked at her then, and the full, startling weight of his solitude hit her. He was not his father. He had kept the Greylan not as a trophy, but as something else, a reminder perhaps of a wildness he also kept caged within himself. "Strength is not the same as dominance," Ilara said softly, voicing the thought he had left unspoken. "Sometimes it is just enduring." His eyes held hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw a flicker of raw, tanned, unguarded vulnerability. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. He was not being witnessed by his court or his enemies or his advisors. He was being witnessed by her, a kitchen maid in a dark kennel. And as he had realized a week ago that was worse, it was so much worse than being saved, it was being seen. The delicate balance of their secret world was shattered by the arrival of Lord Valerius. He did not come to the kennels again. He was more subtle than that. He made his move in the full light of day in the king's public court. Alara was not there to see it, but the story flew through the castle's servant passages like wildfire. Valerius, with his charming smile and serpent's tongue, had raised a concern about the king's distraction. He spoke of the Greylan, the beast in the dark as a festering liability, a creature of the old savage world that had no place in their enlightened kingdom. He recounted, with feigned regret, the story of the guard who had lost his arm. He painted a picture of a ticking threat, a monster that could break free, a symbol not of the king's power, but of his sentimentality, a weakness. Then he delivered his masterstroke. He proposed a public demonstration to reaffirm the king's strength and resolve, a culling. The king himself would execute the beast before the court and visiting dignitaries. It would be a spectacle of power, a reminder to all that Kalen was his father's son, a man who could master the wild, a king who would not be ruled by a pet. The alternative, Valerius smoothly suggested, was to release it back into the blighted peaks, an act that would be seen as soft, merciful, and unforgivably weak. He had crafted the perfect political trap. To kill the Greylan would be to destroy the strange, fragile bridge being built between Kalen and Alara. It would be an act of self-mutilation for him, a betrayal of the understanding they had reached in the dark. But to refuse would be to hand Valerius the very weapon he needed, confirming the rumors of his weakness and giving his political enemies a banner to rally under. That night, Kalen did not come to the kennels. Alara went alone, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The Greyland seemed to sense her distress. It did not pace or roar, but sat quietly, its ember eyes fixed on her, making a low, crooning sound of comfort. She fed it, her hands moving automatically, her mind racing. She was the cause of this. Her quiet little rebellion had become the fulcrum on which the fate of the kingdom might turn. She had made the beast, more than a beast. She had made it a symbol, and now Valerius was twisting that symbol into a noose for the king's neck. A guard appeared at the end of the passage, his face pale. "The king summons you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. To his private study, Alara's blood ran cold. The study was the heart of Kalen's power, a place where laws were signed and wars were planned, a place servants like her never, ever entered. She followed the guard through winding corridors and up staircases she had only ever scrubbed. The study was a vast, circular room lined with books from floor to ceiling. A single fire burned in a massive hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Kalen stood by the window, his back to her, looking out over the sleeping city. He was in his kingly attire now, a dark tunic bearing his silver sigil. The weight of his office settled back on his shoulders. He did not turn around. "You have heard the whispers, I assume." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I have," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Valerius is a patient man. He has been waiting for an opportunity like this for years. He chose his ground well. He still did not turn. He has given me two choices. Both of them are his." Sound of a log, crackling and collapsing in the fireplace. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He was not asking for her advice. He was laying the facts before her, like a map of their shared battlefield. He was showing her the cage he was in, a cage made not of iron bars, but of duty, perception, and politics. She understood then that this was her test. What she said next would define everything. She could plead for the Greyland's life, appeal to the man she had come to know in the darkness. But that would be confirming Valerius's accusation that he was ruled by sentiment. She could tell him to kill it, to be the king his court demanded. But that would be a betrayal of the truth they had found. So she did neither. She walked further into the room, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. She stopped a few feet behind him. "A cage is only a cage if you believe in the bars," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. He finally turned. His face was a study in controlled conflict. The king and the man at war behind his eyes. He had expected her to plead. He had expected her to weep. He had not expected her to hand him a key. Her words were not about the Graylin. They were about him, about the choices he thought he didn't have, about the kingship he was trapped within. She was not asking him to save the beast. She was challenging him to save himself. A slow, dangerous light began to dawn in his storm-gray eyes. The king was looking at his board, at the two moves his enemy had given him, and for the first time, he was seeing a third. The day of the demonstration dawned, gray and cold. A platform had been erected in the main courtyard, and below it, the black cage had been wheeled into the open, exposed to the pale, unforgiving light. The Graylin was restless, agitated by the crowds, the noise, the scent of so many fearful people. It paced the confines of its prison, its scales catching the flat light like chips of obsidian. The court was assembled, a riot of color and silks against the grim stone walls. Lord Valerius stood near the platform, his expression one of sober satisfaction. He had won, no matter what the king did. Alara watched from a high window in the kitchens, a place she was not supposed to be. Her hands were clenched so tightly, her knuckles were white. She could not bear to watch, but she could not bear to look away. Kalen emerged onto the platform. He was dressed in black leather armor, simple and severe. In his hand, he carried not the ceremonial executioner's axe that everyone expected, but his own long sword, a weapon of battle. A murmur went through the crowd. This would be a warrior's kill, not a butcher's. He walked to the edge of the platform and looked down at the cage, his face impassive. He did not look at Valerius. He looked only at the beast. Then he did something no one, least of all, Valerius, could have anticipated. He descended the steps of the platform. He walked across the courtyard until he stood before the cage, placing himself on the same level as the creature. The guards tensed, their hands flying to their weapons. Kalen raised a single hand, a clear gesture for them to stand down. He sheathed his sword, the clean, sharp sound of steel sliding into a leather scabbard. The crowd gasped, a disarmed king. Valerius's smug expression faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. Kalen gestured for a servant, who brought him a small, covered dish. He took it, uncovered it. Inside was a piece of raw red meat laced with the same calming herbs Alara used. He knelt. The king of a continent, in his armor, knelt in the dirt before the cage of a monster. He did not slide it through the bars. He spoke to the royal locksmith, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the stunned silence of the courtyard. "Open it!" The locksmith stared, horrified. Valerius took a step forward. "Your Majesty, this is madness!" Kalen did not even glance at him. His gaze was locked with the Greylands. "Open it," he repeated, his voice like iron. The locksmith, trembling, obeyed. With a series of loud metallic clicks, the great lock was undone. The cage door swung open with a low groan. The Greyland stopped pacing. It stared at the open door, at the kneeling man. It could taste the fear of the crowd. It could kill the man before it, and a dozen others before they could stop it. Kalen did not move. He held out the meat on his open palm, an offering of profound trust. Her ritual. But he was not imitating her. He was claiming it as his own. He was showing them all that true power was not about forcing a beast to its knees, but about having the strength to kneel before it. The Greyland took a hesitant step out of the cage. It was larger in the open air, more terrifying. A wave of fear rippled through the onlookers, but it did not attack. It walked slowly toward the king. It lowered its massive head, and with a delicacy that stunned the entire court into breathlessness, it took the meat from his hand. Then it rested its snout for a brief moment against the king's shoulder. It was an act of allegiance, of acceptance. A bond forged in darkness, now displayed in the light for all to see. Kalen rose slowly, his hand resting on the Greylin's scaled neck. He turned to face his court, to face Valerius, with the most dangerous creature in the kingdom standing calmly at his side, untethered and unchained. He had not chosen either of the options in the trap. He had smashed the trap to pieces. He looked at Valerius, and his voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of absolute victory. It seems my pet is no longer a liability. It is now the sworn protector of this crown. See that it is given new quarters. The royal gardens will do. He had not only saved the beast, he had elevated it. He had taken Valerius's symbol of weakness and transformed it into the ultimate symbol of his reign, a power earned not through fear, but through a quiet, terrifying understanding. The whispers were not of the king's weakness, but of his strange and formidable power. Lord Valerius was conspicuously absent from court, sent on a long and indefinite diplomatic mission to the frozen northern wastes. The Graelin roamed the walled royal gardens, a magnificent dark guardian amidst the roses and stone fountains, a living testament to the day the king redefined strength. Elara did not see Kaelin for 3 days. She went about her duties in the kitchens, her world returned to its normal rhythms, yet everything was changed. She was no longer just a servant girl. She was a secret keeper, a catalyst. She felt the shift in the way the other servants looked at her, with a mixture of awe and fear. She was the girl who had tamed the king's monster, and perhaps the king himself. On the 3rd night, she felt a pull toward the gardens. She did not know why, but her feet carried her there, down a flagstone path lit by the moon. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. She found him standing by a silent fountain, watching the Graelin as it slept in a patch of moonlight, its great body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. He was not wearing armor or the trappings of a king, just a simple tunic and breeches. He looked younger in the soft light. The hard lines of his face softened. He heard her approach, but did not turn. "He seems to like the freedom," Kaelin said, his voice a quiet sound in the vast stillness of the garden. "He was never meant for a cage," Elara replied, stopping beside him. They stood in silence for a long time, a comfortable, shared silence that was the culmination of all their nights in the kennel. It was not empty. It was full of everything they had not said, everything they now understood. "The gardens are vast," he said, finally turning to look at her. His gray eyes seemed to capture the moonlight. "A beautiful cage is still a cage, perhaps," she said, "or perhaps it is just the first step out of one." He looked at her, and she saw in his face the truth of her words. He, too, was taking his first step. The crown was still his, the duties still bound him, but he was no longer a prisoner of his father's legacy or his cousin's ambitions. He had found a different path. "Your actions in the courtyard, they were dangerous," she said softly. "They were necessary," he corrected. "You taught me that some risks must be taken, that true strength is not invulnerability." He took a step closer, and the space between them shimmered with a tension that was both new and ancient. He did not touch her. His presence was enough. I am in your debt, Ilara. You owe me nothing, your majesty. No, he said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant pitch that sent a shiver through her. I owe you everything. There were no declarations, no promises of a future she could not imagine. He did not need to offer her jewels or titles or a place at his side. He offered her something far more valuable, far more intimate. He offered her the truth of his silence. He reached out, not to touch her face or her hand, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her cheek. A gesture so simple, so unexpectedly tender, it stole the breath from her lungs. His fingers barely grazed her skin, but the contact was electric, a brand of heat and cold all at once. Then he let his hand fall silence, punctuated only by the distant sound of the sleeping Greylin's breathing. The world exhaled. The climax had passed. The danger was gone, and what was left was this: a man and a woman standing in a moonlit garden with a sleeping monster nearby. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, forged in darkness and sealed in a quiet that was more profound than any vow.